When my ex-husband asked about our divorce, it wasn't the question that hurt me. It was the calmness in his voice, as if he were asking about the weather. We stood in the same cafe where we once planned our future, the same place where I had laughed too loudly to hide my nerves on our first date. Time had passed, but the air around him still carried the weight of memories I never asked to keep. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, stirring his coffee. I smiled, gently relieved face, the kind of smile women learn when they've cried enough in private. A polite curve of the lips, no trembling, no anger. He mistook it for peace. He didn't know it was armor. Inside me, the past cracked open. I remembered the girl I was before marriage, hopeful, trusting, endlessly patient. I remembered how I learned to measure my words so they wouldn't upset him, how I shrank my dreams so they wouldn't inconvenience his plans. Love, for me, had slowly turned into endurance, and endurance into silence. Our marriage didn't end with a loud fight. It ended quietly, with distance, indifference, and the feeling of being unnecessary in my own home. He stopped asking how my day was. I stopped expecting him to care. Somewhere between unpaid emotional debts and unspoken resentment, we became strangers sharing a roof. But none of that compared to the day our son looked at me with unfamiliar eyes. "I don't want you as my mom anymore." Those words didn't fall, they stabbed. I remember the room spinning, the sound of my own heartbeat roaring in my ears. I had carried him inside me for 9 months. I had stayed awake through fevers, whispered prayers into his hair, skipped meals so he could eat better. And yet, in that moment, I was nothing more than an inconvenience he wanted removed. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him how much that sentence would haunt me for years. I simply nodded. That night, I cried into my pillow until my chest burned. I wondered what kind of mother raises a child who can discard her so easily. I replayed every mistake, every raised voice, every moment I chose discipline over softness. I blamed myself for loving him imperfectly in a world that demands mothers be flawless. The divorce followed soon after. Papers were signed, promises dissolved. I walked out of that marriage with a suitcase and a heart full of unanswered questions. People said time would heal everything. They didn't mention how slow time becomes when you're alone. Standing across from my ex now, years later, I realized something painful he had healed. Or perhaps he had never been as wounded as I was. "I don't regret what made me stronger," I replied calmly. He studied my face, maybe searching for cracks. He wouldn't find them. I had learned to hide my fractures beautifully. As we talked, I noticed how he avoided mentioning our son. Maybe guilt made his throat tight. Maybe he believed I had forgotten. But a mother never forgets the sound of her child rejecting her. "That echo lives forever. When we parted ways," he said, "you seemed different." I smiled again. This time it was real, not because I was happy, but because I had survived. As I walked away, I understood something clearly for the first time. I had spent years proving my worth to people who never planned to protect my heart. That chapter of my life was over. I wasn't walking away broken anymore. I was walking away awakened. And though my smile looked gentle, inside me a quiet decision had already been made. I would never beg to be chosen again. After the divorce, the world didn't collapse the way I thought it would. Instead, it continued cruelly normal while I learned how to exist in the empty spaces it left behind. Mornings arrived whether I was ready or not. The sun still rose, mocking the heaviness in my chest, as if nothing important had been lost. I moved into a small apartment that echoed with silence. No footsteps, no arguments, no laughter. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing reminding me I was still alive. I told myself this was freedom, but freedom felt cold when you didn't know who you were without someone else defining you. People talked, they always do. Some whispered that I must have failed as a wife. Others said a good mother never loses her child emotionally. Their words were never spoken to my face, but judgment has a way of traveling through looks, pauses, and forced politeness. I learned to smile at gatherings while my heart begged to be unseen. At night, loneliness became my loudest companion. I would lie awake, replaying my son's words. wondering if he remembered the woman who used to sing him to sleep. Did he remember how I stayed up all night sewing his school costume? Or had my absence rewritten his memory of me into something unimportant? Guilt is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that love should hurt, and that suffering is proof of devotion. I drowned in it for months, apologizing silently to people who were no longer listening. Then one evening, while folding laundry, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized her. My shoulders were slumped. My eyes looked older than my years. I saw a woman who had loved fiercely and been discarded quietly. And for the first time, instead of pity, I felt anger not at them, but at myself. When had love become self-erasure? That question stayed with me. I started small. I woke up early and went for walks, not to lose weight or escape pain, but to feel the ground beneath my feet again. I cooked meals just for myself, setting the table as if I mattered. I said no to people who drained me, and yes to silence that healed me. Some nights were still unbearable. Healing isn't graceful. It's messy and slow and full of relapses. There were days I cried in grocery store aisles, and nights I hugged my pillow like it was the only thing keeping me anchored. But slowly something shifted. I began to remember things I once loved, reading late into the night, writing thoughts no one would judge, dreaming without asking permission. I realized I had spent so many years being chosen that I forgot how to choose myself. Survival turned into awareness. I found work again, not glamorous, but honest. Each paycheck felt like proof that I could stand on my own. Independence didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as exhaustion and pride mixed together. Occasionally, my phone would light up with my ex-husband's name. Short messages, neutral words. He asked how I was doing. I answered politely, briefly. I refused to open doors I had just finished closing. My son remained silent. That hurt more than any argument ever could. But instead of chasing his love, I learned something radical. A mother's worth does not disappear when her child turns away. Love does not expire because it is unreturned. One night, as rain tapped against my window, I whispered a promise to myself. If I was strong enough to love them without conditions, I am strong enough to rebuild myself without their approval. In that moment, I understood I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was becoming someone they would one day look at and realize, she didn't break when we left. She transformed. Change didn't announce itself with dramatic music or sudden miracles. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Day after day, I showed up for myself, even when motivation was low and the past whispered that none of it mattered. I didn't realize at first that consistency was rebuilding me from the inside out. I started standing straighter, speaking clearer, laughing without checking who was listening. The woman in the mirror no longer looked apologetic. She looked awake. Work became more than survival. I learned new skills, stayed late when it mattered, and refused to shrink my ideas. The same determination I once poured into saving a failing marriage now fueled my independence. Each small success stitched confidence back into places where doubt had lived for years. People noticed. Compliments felt strange at first. I had grown used to being invisible, but slowly I allowed myself to accept them without deflection. I didn't owe anyone modesty that erased my effort. Then, unexpectedly, my ex-husband reached out, not about paperwork, not about logistics about me. I heard you're doing really well, he said one afternoon over the phone. I smiled, not the polite, protective smile from before, but an easy one. I am. There was a pause. I could feel his curiosity growing, mixed with something else, regret, perhaps. The tone of his voice carried surprise, as if he had expected me to remain frozen in the version of myself he left behind. We met again, briefly, in a public place. He looked the same. I didn't. He studied me the way people examine something they once owned but no longer understand. I could see it in his eyes, the silent question. When did she become this confident without me? I answered with calm kindness. No bitterness, no longing, just distance, and that distance unsettled him more than anger ever could. Around the same time, I heard from a mutual friend that my son had asked about me. Nothing direct, just a quiet curiosity. Apparently, he had overheard people praising my strength, my work, the way I had rebuilt my life from nothing. The knowledge didn't bring instant relief. It brought clarity. I realized I no longer needed their validation to feel complete. Their recognition had arrived too late to be necessary. Still, moments of ache remained. Healing doesn't erase love, it reorganizes it. I loved my son without expectation now. I sent silent prayers instead of messages. I trusted that time would explain what words never could. The real transformation wasn't external, it was in how I responded. When my ex hinted at what we could have been, I didn't argue. I didn't reminisce, I simply said, "I hope you're happy." And I meant it because his happiness no longer defined mine. That was the moment I understood the power of silent revenge. I wasn't punishing him, I wasn't proving anything. I was living well, and living well had become my loudest answer. People often think revenge requires cruelty or confrontation. But the most unsettling revenge is growth. It forces others to face the version of you they underestimated. I had become the woman they never expected, not hardened by pain, but refined by it. My softness returned, stronger than before, because it was no longer rooted in fear. One evening, as I closed my laptop after a long day, I felt a deep, unfamiliar peace settle in my chest. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't replaying conversations or anticipating regrets. I was present, and I knew, without doubt, that if they ever looked back at me now, they wouldn't see the woman they left behind. They would see the woman who rose quietly, gracefully, and completely on her own. Closure doesn't arrive the way we imagine it will. There is no dramatic reunion, no perfect apology that erases the past. Closure comes softly, often when you no longer need it. I understood that the day my ex-husband called again, his voice heavier than before, careful, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking about our divorce," he said, "about everything." I listened without interruption. There was a time when those words would have pulled me back into old emotions. Hope, anger, longing. Now they landed gently and passed through me like air. I realized then how much I had changed. We both did what we thought was right at the time. I replied. He sighed. Regret sat openly in his silence. For the first time, he spoke of loneliness, of mistakes, of realizing too late that love isn't loud, it's consistent. I didn't interrupt him, not because I was waiting to speak, but because I no longer needed to. A few days later, my son reached out. The message was short, awkward, honest. I didn't understand back then. I'm sorry. I stared at my phone for a long time. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the weight of motherhood that never leaves, even when it's wounded. I remembered his small hands gripping my finger, his laughter filling rooms, the way I once believed my love would always be enough. I replied simply, "I've always loved you." No explanations, no guilt, no conditions. We met weeks later. He was taller now, older in ways that made my heart ache. There was hesitation in his eyes, fear that I might reject him the way he once rejected me. I smiled, not the guarded smile, not the practiced one, but the smile of a mother who had survived heartbreak without letting it turn into bitterness. We talked slowly, carefully, like people learning a language they once spoke fluently. I didn't rush forgiveness. I didn't demand closeness. I let trust rebuild at its own pace. That was my final victory, not revenge, release. My ex-husband tried once more to reopen a door we had both closed years ago. This time, I didn't hesitate. "I forgive you," I said gently, "but I won't return." He nodded, understanding at last. Some chapters end not because love disappears, but because growth demands a different story. As I walked away, I felt no triumph, no sadness, only peace, the kind that comes when you stop carrying wounds as proof of love. I had learned that forgiveness doesn't mean access, love doesn't mean sacrifice of self, and healing doesn't require anyone's permission. That night, I stood by my window, watching city lights flicker like distant stars. I thought about the woman I once was, the one who begged silently to be chosen. I thanked her for surviving long enough to become me. I smiled again, relieved face gently, honestly, freely. This time the smile wasn't armor. It was closure.